Hey, I'm bankruptcy attorney Matt McCune. Welcome to the Bankruptcy Show, the show your creditors really don't want you to watch or listen to. We're going to break down the facts about debt and bankruptcy, showing you what your legal rights really are and giving you the information that you need to take care of yourself and your family. Let's get into today's episode. All right, let's get into this means test bullshit. Episode 4, deep dive on the infamous means test that revolutionized bankruptcy, not in a positive way. I talked about this a little bit before. Let's go back in time. It's 2005. The credit card, the big banks have been crying foul on the bankruptcy system for a long time, pushing for reform. Their opportunity arrives in 2004 into 5. And so the idea is this. There was this perception that there was rampant abuse in the bankruptcy system. There was not. I was a practicing attorney in the 4 to 5 years running up to 2005 reform. There's always some abuse because there's dickheads everywhere, but it was a very small number. So whatever, big banks wanted a bankruptcy reform and the opportunity came and they took it. So the idea behind the means test was basically like, hey, we want to formalize people's eligibility for bankruptcy. The idea was if you had a good, amazing lawyer like myself, you could maybe get through a Chapter 7, whereas you should have been in a Chapter 13. Maybe, but look, anytime you just complicate things greater, honestly, the lawyers make more money because you can charge more and it costs more. And 20 years into it, I don't think it accomplished much, but it is what it is. So there was a set of standards that the government had. This was from the Internal Revenue Service. So if you fall behind on your taxes and you would reach out to the IRS and say, hey, I want to do an offer in compromise, that sort of thing. What the IRS created these national and local standards depending on where you lived. And that helped the IRS collection agent basically determine what you should afford to pay to the IRS as you're trying to pay your taxes back. So that was already in place. So then you get the government saying, hey, we want to create a formula to apply to bankruptcy people, but we don't want to actually, do any work or whatever. Let's just steal from the IRS. So there were these numbers that were out there that was available to the federal government to borrow for the bankruptcy means test. So you want to think about the means test really in 2 parts, right? There's the first part, and this is where we're going to talk about median income. And are you above or below? Because it's very important. If you're above, then you get to move on to phase 2. We'll talk about that. If you're below, you're kind of done with phase 1. You don't even have to go into the calculation of disposable income. So what the hell is median income? So it's the middle. Right? Why did they pick that? Well, fuck, I don't know. You had to pick something, I guess. So the census data comes out twice a year, I think. And so basically, you got income here and income here. And in the middle, that's the median. So the idea is if you're financially making more money than the person right in the middle, one set of rules apply to you. If you're making money below, another set of rules. So these numbers change state by state. And again, this is why it's so important to make sure you have a quality bankruptcy attorney in your district so they can help you figure this stuff out. So we're going to talk about Colorado numbers as an example. I'm a Colorado attorney. So here's my fancy graphic. Look at this. So this over here, this really represents household size. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it goes up and up and up. And down below, there's income, right? So in Colorado right now, in its fall of 2005, the median income for a family of 1 is $83,000, right? So if I'm a solo, single person, whatever, it might median income, and we're going to talk how we calculate that, is below $83,000. It's presumed I can file Chapter 7. Now, I may not even be able to. What if I have a Chapter 7 in the last 8 years? What if I'm trying to save my house from foreclosure? What if I got some assets that might be a risk in Chapter 7, right? So that doesn't mean for sure you're going to do a Chapter 7, but it's presumed that you can if your income's below $83,000. And same deal if I'm a family of 2 it's 106. And if I'm 3, 124, and then 4, 147, oh shit. And then, and then the number goes up about $11,000 for each additional person in your household size. So that's the idea, right? The more people you got in your house, the more expensive it's going to be, et cetera, et cetera. So this bar graph kind of represents that. So there's a couple things to talk about in there. First is household size, right? This is stuff that we argue about all the time. Typically, we're going to look at the way you filed your taxes in the last year prior to your bankruptcy, right? If I'm claiming 4, I got a married couple with 2 kids, we're claiming 4, that's a household of 4, pretty simple. But what if I'm divorced, we got 2 kids, and I only claim, 1 kid, right? Or there's only 1 child, the kid gets claimed back and forth. These are things, look, that's why you have a lawyer, right? Because there's all this sort of stuff to fight about. Because you ultimately want to determine your household size to your benefit, which means for the debtor, the person trying to get through bankruptcy, you want your household size to be as high as possible, right? Now, so that's household size. That's not totally clear, to be honest. That's the way it works. And then the other bar graph, down low was income. All right, so where do we come up with these numbers? So the bankruptcy code is pretty specific about this. You take the gross income, the 6 months prior to the month in which you file bankruptcy. So like it's October of 2025. So I don't count October. I go to September, and then I go back 6 months, whatever the hell that is. I take that gross figure, before taxes, deductions, all that sort of stuff, and I double it. Right? So, and that's where we get this presumption of what your disposable income is. And that's, to a degree, that's a bit of the holy grail within the bankruptcy. The bankruptcy code wants to presume that the last 6 months prior to the month in which you filed the bankruptcy is the end-all be-all to where your income's going to lie. And if there's not what the Supreme Court referred to as changed circumstances, then you kind of have to stick with those numbers to a degree. Now, and that's tough because, no 1 month is the same for any family, but this is the game that we have to deal with. So I figure out my household size. I look at my gross income. I go back 6 months prior to the month of filing, and I double that number, right? That's my magic number. If the number is up here, right? Let's say I got a family of 2. My number's up here. I'm an above median income debtor. What does that mean? Chapter 7 is going to be tough, right? Now, what if, if you're way up here at 130 or something, that's one thing. What if you're just barely above? It doesn't mean you cannot do a Chapter 7. And if your bankruptcy attorney tells you that, you need to fire that motherfucker, okay? Look, if you're barely above, there's still arguments that you can make that you don't have any disposable income. You just have to now go through part 2 of the test, and we're going to talk about what that looks like. So for 7, you presume if you're above it, it's going to be tough. If you're below it, you're presumed to be eligible, even if you want to do a 7. Maybe you got other reasons. Okay, so let's talk about what if we're in a Chapter 13. Well, sometimes I'm in a Chapter 13 because I am above, right? The government says, hey, you're way above the number. We believe you have disposable income. You need to file a Chapter 13. And if your means test number is above the threshold, guess what? The powers that be want you in the 5-year plan. If you're below the number, right, and even you need to file a 13 for whatever reason, you can do a 3-year plan. So, the means test number is incredibly important. Now, can you get out of that? Of course. Like, what if I lost my job last month? I was making a bunch of money. I was way over. I lose my job. Can I now do a 7? Likely, because you have changed circumstances. That went to the Supreme Court. Some asshole trustee out there tried to force someone into Chapter 13 that had lost their job. Come on, man. And then, but it had to go all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, no, that's crazy. If you have a financial change that's substantial and potentially continued, blah blah blah, you can get away from the means test. But what if you needed to file a Chapter 13 in that instance? Even though your income may be dropped, now you got to have a source of income to file a 13, but let's say your income dropped below the number, well, you're still going to be held to that 5-year plan because you were an above median income debtor. That's bullshit. One super handsome, super smart lawyer locally fought that issue, and to be fair, I lost. It was Judge Tallman, 2006-7, and he was probably right. That was the interpretation of the code. So, okay, so pretty cut and dry. If I'm below, right? I can hopefully do a 7 if I'm eligible. Otherwise, if I got to do a 13 for whatever reason, I can do the short version, go through 3 years. If I'm above, it's going to be tough to do chapter 7. They're likely going to push me into a 13. And now I got to do at least a 5-year plan. So that's part 1 of the means test. If you're under, you're done with it. If you're over, come on over to part 2, the calculation of your disposable income. And this is where those IRS numbers come in, right? So it's really interesting. Like, we figure out where your income is, and then we start subtracting expenses, right? Well, anytime you're the bankrupt debtor, you kind of want to interpret your income low, your expenses high. But understand there are powers that oppose that. Bankruptcy trustees typically going to do the inverse. They want to interpret your income high and your expenses lower. That's the yin and the yang. That's what I spend an unbelievable amount of my time is fighting over disposable income. So, I'm above median, right? I got to go through this formula now. All my pay stubs for 6 months have to be entered. I get to take my tax deductions, retirement, and, all these things that we've been fighting over the last 20 years. And most of this stuff is fairly settled at this point. But certain categories of my expenses, I'm not allowed to actually deduct what I spend. If I'm going out to eat every month, and I'm dropping too large a month on eating out and shit, don't forget. I always remind my clients, I say, hey, don't forget, you're kind of the bad guy in this. Because you didn't do anything wrong or anything, but the presumption is you're not paying your bills. You're the one looking for debt relief, and so you have to kind of play the game. In chapter 13, I get clients that are in there like, this sucks. Well, it was always better than what they were doing before. And I'm giving them a light at the end of the tunnel, but I get it can be tough. And chapter 13 is voluntary. I say, hey, man, you don't have to do this. Stop paying your case or get dismissed. Figure something else out. Good luck with that. So what can I deduct from my budget, right? Well, if I have like a home loan, typically I can deduct the mortgage. Although if my payment's ridiculous, sometimes the trustees are like, hey, that's too much. You're asking to take money out of the pocket of your unsecured creditors. You're paying like $7-8 grand a month on a mortgage or even lower. That can be a fight that we get into. But basically, secured assets, homes, cars, that sort of stuff, you can deduct those expenses. And then when you get into food, clothing, transportation, that sort of stuff, you don't always actually get to deduct what you spend. You get to deduct what the IRS says you should be deducting for certain categories. Does it make sense? No, come on, but it is what it is. And then there are some special circumstance categories. So there's some gray room in there. And this is where, this is the sort of stuff that's unbelievably important to have someone who knows this stuff inside and out. Dabblers cannot do good in bankruptcy. You'll go onto someone's website and say, I do family law, I do bankruptcy, I do wills and estates. Now, move on. This shit is too complicated. You have to live in this world constantly to fully understand how it works. But there are arguments that can be made, and you're going to want a good attorney that is willing to make those arguments to your benefit, right? To try to, one, maybe if you were really just slightly above the median, maybe you can bump down into Chapter 7 eligibility. If you're a 13, well, your Chapter 13, how much you pay every month to the Chapter 13 trustee is going to depend on what your disposable income is. My income's here, my expenses are here. The delta, that difference, is what you pay in a Chapter 13. My job for my clients is to get that number as low as possible. There are competing interests out there that are trying to get you to pay more, and that's the dance, right? That is the adversarial system that is the United States justice system. So categories are tricky, all this sort of stuff. Oh, hell, what else did I want to cover? Look, for the most part, I think that's the big picture of the means test. Now, we fight about all sorts of stuff. We've been fighting about this 20 years. Can I do my my 401k deduction? Or what if you're over withholding on your taxes? And how many cars does someone need? All this sort of stuff we spend an incredible amount of time litigating within the bankruptcy system to determine disposable income for folks moving forward. Like, in a nutshell, that's the means test. This stuff is complicated. I could go on for 45 minutes. No one will watch that. It is what it is. It's the current system. It's imperfect. That's the way things go. I cannot stress enough how important it is to get someone who knows these things inside and out. We're talking about 5 years, right? And there are a lot of dipshit lawyers out there that won't push back. They don't know that. They're just paper pushers, man. They're just like, hey, I filed this thing. Trustee said no, you got to pay this. Sorry. Right? You don't want that. I mean, and that's the problem with this world is you'll kind of, when you're looking to hire someone, well, you're looking for the cheapest lawyer typically. If you're in a 13, I would not be hiring the first cheapest option I get, because this could cost you. I have seen 13s. I've cleaned up messes. I've come into cases after lawyers have been disbarred or got fired by their clients or all this sort of stuff. And I've seen the craziest shit. Like, some of it's criminal, in my opinion, but no one cares if it's only poor people getting screwed. That's the truth. Means test 101. Look, if you got other questions, put some comments in there and I'll get to them. Look, ChatGPT is getting pretty good about some of this stuff. So in the old days when people were like, I went on the internet, I'd be like, oh my God, here we go. I'm getting calls from people now. They're like, well, obviously they talk to ChatGPT more and more every day. And look, there's pretty good info for you on there to understand these things. And dare I say, depending on who you hire, you might understand these issues better than your attorney with some of these new technologies that are out there. But look, the means test is a concern. It certainly does not mean that you're not eligible to file bankruptcy. If you get forced into Chapter 13, the biggest misunderstanding about Chapter 13 is that you have to pay your creditors in full. You do not. Watch my spiel on Chapter 13. I think it's episode 3. And have a great day.